It's great to be back in Houston. Like many of the previous speakers, I lived here in the late 80s when I was Vice President and Regional Manager for Union Pacific Resources. And I want to compliment ASPO on the whole effort that they make on focusing on this very important problem. Oil is appropriately at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're talking about, but I think it's only the tip of the iceberg. I think that what we see in oil, we're also seeing in many of our other energy areas and also in the mineral areas. And I'd like to talk about some of those. The first thing I'd like to do is remove the word potential, because we are being significantly impacted by what's going on in China and India and the rest of the world. In terms of population, China has 1.3 billion, we have 0.3 billion, and India around 1 billion. The land area that each has, China and the U.S., are about 10 million. I was surprised that India was so low with only 3 million square miles, because we call it a subcontinent. In GDP, we're still the big elephant on the block, but many economists are predicting that China will pass us by 2030. And India is, I saw a Goldman Sachs thing earlier this year that predicted that India might pass us by 2050. And the reason is that their economies are growing much faster than ours. China, over the last 3 years, has averaged 10.4% growth in GDP per year. India is around 7 to 9, and we get real excited when we get to 3. The use of electrical energy, I think, really frames what's going on and what's been going on in the 21st century very nicely. In the last 16 years, the world's increased its electrical generation and consumption by 7.2 terawatts. 52% of that is just these 3 countries. And when we look at the breakout of that, China is the big elephant on that one again. And one of the things that's interesting about China, if you look at the slope for the 20th century, it's fairly robust, but it really takes off in the 21st century. And that's what we're seeing in terms of usage of natural resources of all sorts, that there's been this explosion in the 21st century that's like nothing the world's ever seen. One of the things that's really important to remember is that the other 48% of the world wants their piece of this pie also, and it doesn't make any difference whether you're looking at Bangladesh or Africa. They've all increased their energy and electrical consumption over that same time period. Well, people ask very commonly, doesn't China produce a lot of their own natural resources? And the answer is yes. They're number 1 in the world in all of these commodities. They're number 2 in these additional ones and number 3 in these. So 15 of 17 important commodities, they're one of the top 3 producers in the world. Oil stands out where they're only 6th in the world. Let's take a look at copper, number 2 producer in the world. They didn't have to import a lot until the end of the 20th century, and then in the 21st century they took off, and today they're the number 1 importer of copper in the world. So they're the number 2 producer and the number 1 importer. And they are getting close to having to import half of what they need. Why do we care? I'm using Colorado because that's my state. You can go to your state and find pretty much the same sorts of things. You talk to the little manufacturer that builds electrical switches for coal mines in Colorado, 10,000, 20,000 volt sorts of things. He came up to me after a talk and told me about the problems that he was having because of shortages in copper and because of the price increases in copper. We had 2,300 pounds of copper stolen from 2 different substations in North Denver last spring, and a guy was arrested a couple of weeks later in Pueblo from stealing from construction sites. And it's pretty well acknowledged that if you have an empty home anywhere around, it's liable to get stripped of copper. The increased costs that we get from this. And here's an old 1800s copper mine in western Colorado that's currently being developed and permitted for reopening. Take a look at crude iron ore. China's the number 1 producer of iron ore in the world. Up until the 20th century, or end of the 20th century, they didn't have to import a lot, but they just exploded during the 21st century, and they are now the number 1 importer. So they're the number 1 producer and the number 1 importer of iron ore in the world. A couple of years ago, they bought an iron mine in Minnesota. And the reason, of course, is the demand for steel. The building that's going on there is astronomical. Shanghai in 1985 had one skyscraper. Today it has over 300. If you do the math, that's over one skyscraper per month for 20 straight years. And that's just one city. Same sorts of things were going on in a couple of the other major cities, such as Beijing. The numbers from China are just astounding. I can recite them, but I really can't comprehend them. They became the third largest car manufacturer last year. All of these things consume huge amounts of steel. Chairman Mao started the 5-year plan concept back in the 50s. They're just rolled out their 11th 5-year plan, and you haven't really seen anything yet because they're going to expend a lot more and they're going to do a lot more building. And they tend to meet those 5-year plans. Oil, I just want to say a few things since the whole conference is on that. China likes oil. These are, all of these graphs are from 1965 to 2006. They have to import 49% now. India likes oil. They have to import nearly 70%. The U.S. likes oil, and we have to import 67%. All of these three major countries competing for an increasing piece of the world global demand for oil. If you're a pessimist on U.S. oil production, you say that we are in steep decline. If you're an optimist, you say that we've had a broad plateau and we're in a gentle decline. It doesn't make any difference how you stretch the graph or how you compress it. There's a fundamental fact in the data that we are producing 1.6 billion barrels less than what we were producing in 1970. One of the things that we hear is that technology is going to save us when world oil peaks. The technology is just going to mean that we really don't have a problem. And I think that the history of the U.S., we peaked in world oil in 1970, and we peaked in U.S. oil in 1970, and we peaked in U.S. gas in 1973. And if you look at the technological advances that have happened since then, in the early 70s we had bright spot technology. We had massive fracture technology in the mid-70s. We had coal bed methane technology in the late 70s and early 80s. 42% of our gas production in Colorado comes from coal bed methane. 3D seismic technology. Seismic workstations that are unbelievable in their capabilities. Horizontal drilling. CO2 flooding has come in. And computer advances. When I was exploration manager for the Overthrust Belt for Amoco, we ran the second 3D survey in the nation. We took that data and we sent it to Tulsa to be processed on mainframe computers. 6 months later, our geophysicists got the data, the hard copies back to work with. Today you can sit there in real time with your laptop next to the truck and see what's going on. And so all of these advances, and yet U.S. oil has been on a steady decline. And we are going to have advances this significant and perhaps more significant in the future, but I think the history of the U.S. tells us that it's not going to save us as for when peak oil finally comes on a worldwide basis. And of course, as a result of that, we've got a lot of looking at the oil shale at Colorado again. We have rich resources of that. Within the red circle, there's a quarter of a mile thick of very, very rich oil shale. But we have yet to see it, and the question is, will we ever see it? Natural gas. China likes gas. India likes gas. The U.S. liked gas during the 90s, but we've sort of plateaued, and I happen to think personally that's a very good thing. And the reason is that for our production, one of the most astounding things that I heard at the 2005 Peak Oil Conference was when Matt Simmons said the U.S. peaked in natural gas consumption in 1973. I didn't think I'd heard him correctly. So I went and looked at the charts, and he's absolutely correct. We did peak in 1973. I was in the industry for more than 20 years, and I didn't realize that. And I can tell you today there are people in the industry that do not realize that. So today we're only capable of producing about 85% of that peak. It's rather interesting, I think, to review very quickly the consumption history in the U.S. In the early 70s, we had a lot of supply disruptions from natural gas. There were schools and factories that were shut down in various places in the country. And factories shutting down was a big deal. There's an aluminum plant in Ravenswood, West Virginia, that when they started back up after their shutdown, it cost them $10 million to start back up. So people didn't trust natural gas supply anymore. Obviously, the industry said, well, the whole reason is because it's controlled by the FPC, and really all we need is deregulation, and we can take care of that. So because of what this disruption in the early 70s, people really didn't trust it, and consumption went down. And then in 1978, we started a long-term temporary oversupply of natural gas in the country, the gas bubble. And that's why I think a lot of us didn't realize that we'd peaked, because we were so worried about working off this temporary oversupply that we didn't realize that we had peaked. And in the early 80s, because of all this declining consumption, we had a conference just several blocks from here. The environmentalists in the gas industry joined together and decided that this was really a great deal, and we promoted the idea of this endless, cheap, reliable, clean fuel that the United States ought to be using everywhere. And that worked. Consumption began increasing rather dramatically. An awful lot of this went into natural gas-fired electrical plants. And still, interestingly, since 2000, in the 21st century, we've had the highest natural gas prices in history, the highest drilling pace that's been going on in 20 years, and yet we've been declining since a peak that we reached in 2001. And so how have we supplied all of these gas-fired power plants and the other demands that have come on? From imports. We are now at over 4 trillion cubic feet a year of imports, or about 20% of our natural gas usage in the United States. So much for endless supply of cheap, reliable fuel. This is the only graph in this talk that has any future forecast. This is a picture by Wood Mackenzie put out a year or so ago, showing that most of the natural gas basins in the United States are in decline. The only place that can really keep the production flat for the next decade has to come from the Rockies or the Yellow. And so far the Rockies have been able to increase production there, but it's questionable how long that can go on. From coal, China likes coal. So far, well, up until last year, they were able to produce all that they consume. They had to start importing coal for the first time. When I first started giving this talk several years ago, I had a little gee-whiz number about 2003 and 2004 that China brought on a new coal-fired power plant every 2.5 weeks. In 2005, it was a new coal-fired power plant every 3 days. India likes coal, and they have to import a little bit of it. U.S. likes coal. We don't have to import any yet. Together, China and the U.S. consume and produce over half the coal in the world. Nuclear. China likes nuclear. India likes nuclear. China and India both want more nuclear and have plans to develop quite a number of reactors. In the U.S., our last nuclear power plant came on in 1996. Of course, it was first put in the process of being built in the 1970s. And since then, have we increased, decreased, or remained flat? I usually poll audiences. I won't embarrass you all. Actually, I wouldn't embarrass you. You all are astute. You probably know the answer. But when I saw this graph, I couldn't believe it. And I checked it in 2 other places. This is actually happening. And this is the best kept secret in America. I think that we've increased our nuclear energy production in the last decade. We've done it because the efficiency has increased in the plants. When the last power plant came on, we were at about 50 to 55% efficiency. We're now up to 90 to 95% efficiency. And of course, everyone thinks that France is the largest nuclear power generator in the world because they have 70% from nuclear power of their energy. But the problem is that France is a very small country. And the United States is the largest producer of nuclear energy by far. We're nearly double the number 2 country, and we're nearly triple the number 3 country. So we got a number of reactors around the world that are using 180 million pounds of uranium each year, but the world's only producing 100 to 110 million pounds of uranium. So how do we do that, smoke and mirrors? Well, we built up huge stockpiles during the last uranium boom, and we've been converting nuclear weapons. We've just about used up the stockpiles worldwide, and we've just about converted all the nuclear weapons that we're going to convert. And so we've got this huge gap. For decades, the price of uranium was running at about $10 a pound. The industry is now understanding that there is a huge impending shortage worldwide, and it's probably liable to get worse with the new reactors that are designed and under construction around the world. So we've reached $136 a pound. We've now declined back under $100 a pound, which we're really thankful for. You think we've got a problem with imports of oil? The United States uses 60 million pounds a year in its reactors, and we produce 2 million pounds a year. Hydro, never going to be particularly big. Colorado, we have about 5%. That's probably what things are worldwide. But when the Three Rivers Gorge dam comes on in China, it's expected to provide about 9% of their electrical needs. 2003 to 2005, we doubled molybdenum exports to China. I gave this talk to the Denver Bar Association, and a woman came up and talked to me about her husband had a small manufacturing plant in Denver, and one of their products was a molybdenum-based automotive lubricant. And she said he had to drop it from his line, and I said, why? Because the price went to $40 a pound? And she said, no, because he couldn't get it. Colorado is North America's largest producer of molybdenum. And here's a company in Colorado that can't get molybdenum. And I've talked to another manufacturer in Denver that's exclusive molybdenum products who's had a horrible time getting the supply for his product to manufacture his products. If you look at precious metal increases, these are percentage price increases from 2003 to about 2 weeks ago. Gold is at a 25-year high. Silver's the highest it's been since the Hunt brothers ran up the price in the mid-'80s. The platinum is at a 26-year high. If we look at base metals, nickel has had a huge increase and is predicted to go higher. Copper, zinc, aluminum. China is the world's largest consumer of aluminum, lead, and tin. So you may have heard about these base metals, but have you heard about antimony lately? Have you heard about bismuth? And you say, now wait a minute, Vince, selenium's dropped back now. Yeah, to where it's only 10 times what it was in 2003. Tellurium's dropped back to where it's only 5 times what it was in 2003. Titanium's only about 3 times what it was in 2003. And vanadium's dropped back to where it's only 6 times what it was in 2003. Cement, we have to worry about cement. Well, China was exporting cement in 2002. 2003, they started importing it, and they tied up the ships. So in 2003, 27 states had shortages, shown here in yellow. By 2004, we had 38 states that had cement shortages. And notice that Colorado doesn't have cement shortages, unless you talk to anybody that dealt with cement in Colorado, and you found out that we had a huge problem. Finally made it in 2005. Seen these 3 countries' names before? They're the 1, 2, and 3 producers of cement in the world. We have to import 22% of our cement. And 81% of our cement production is foreign owned. And this is something that I think is an interesting point to ponder. Many of our extractive industries in this country are foreign owned. And what are the implications of that when we get in global shortages? China knows what they're doing to the world, and they are scouring the world. They're sending people out, they're saying, you go tie up petroleum, you go tie up copper, here's $1.5 billion to go tie up aluminum, and they're going all over the world in doing that. Japan knows what China's doing. They decided last year to double their strategic mineral reserve. Korea looked at what Japan was doing and said, we need to start a strategic mineral reserve. The United States used to have a strategic mineral reserve. I think we still do. There's some recognition that's coming out. One is this is a draft report from the National Research Council entitled Minerals, Critical Minerals in the U.S. Economy. The basic conclusion of this is we need to study this and we need to gather data. There's another draft report from the National Research Council that should be out soon. It's on their website if you want to look at it. Managing Materials for a 21st Century Military. Conclusion 1, the design, structure, and operation of the national defense stockpile render it ineffective in responding to modern needs and threats. Conclusion number 2, the Department of Defense appears not to fully understand its needs for specific materials, nor have adequate information on their supply. At least somebody's beginning to wake up. We're talking about going to alternative energy supplies. Here's a list of 20 minerals that are crucial in alternative energies: photovoltaics, fuel cells, and all of these we have to import over 50% of our needs. Now, one can argue that we don't need to manufacture this stuff anyway, let other people do it. For instance, we are putting our first solar-powered energy plant in southern Colorado. It's under construction right now, a little 8-megawatt plant. The photovoltaics are manufactured in China, and the concentrating panels are manufactured in Germany. So I think there are a number of things that we need to sort of think about with all of this. And one is that we're already suffered from inflation, but unlike oil and natural gas that's sold on the spot market, when we see the price at the pump and at the burner tip as soon as the price of the raw product goes up, many of these things are sold on long-term fixed price contracts still. The prices I was showing you was just spot market price on the London Metal Exchange. And I'll give you an example. Coal, Colorado coal, 2004 to 2005 increased from $17 a ton to $37 a ton on the spot market. Yet the average price was only $21 a ton because of all this long-term contract business. So we've got inflationary pressures, I think, really built into the pipeline from what we're seeing on the spot market. And the other issue is, are we really going to be able to get at any price what we need? Example, the molybdenum situation and the Denver manufacturers. And then, of course, being from the West and being from Colorado, because we're so rich in energy and mineral resources, I'm concerned about us becoming the sacrifice area for the U.S. People of Colorado didn't vote on having commercial leasing on oil shale. Some folks in Washington decided that was a good thing to do, and because 34% of Colorado's federal land, we don't really have much to say about that. And then it's interesting to think about, in this tight global market, whether those companies operating in the United States, whether their first allegiance is going to be to us to supply materials or whether it will be to their home countries. Thanks very much.